In 2025, one single app store on one single company's phones facilitated over $1.4 trillion in economic activity. Think about that for a second. That's more than the entire economy of countries like Spain, and even larger than Australia's GDP. And yet, here's the twist. Apple didn't actually earn most of that money. In fact, on more than 90% of that trillion-dollar figure, Apple took zero commission. Zero. So why is the company fighting billion-dollar lawsuits across the world over something it barely makes money from? Because the number making headlines isn't the number that really matters. And once you see the smaller number Apple is actually protecting, you'll understand why governments, developers, and even billion-dollar companies have spent years trying to break Apple's control over the App Store. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how Apple's App Store really makes its money. And why this tiny slice of the business may be one of the most powerful business models ever created. To understand this trillion-dollar machine, we need to go back to 2008. At the time, smartphones were still new. The App Store launched with only around 500 apps. Most of them were simple games, flashlight apps, calculators, and basic utilities. Nothing about it suggested that it would eventually become one of the most powerful digital marketplaces in history. But Apple made one decision that quietly changed the entire tech industry. Any developer, from anywhere in the world, could build an app and instantly reach millions of iPhone users. As long as Apple received a percentage of every digital sale. At first, that didn't seem like a big deal. Developers suddenly had access to an audience they could never reach on their own. Apple handled payments, security, software updates, and distribution. For many developers, giving Apple a share felt like a fair trade. But over the next decade, that single decision would become one of the most controversial business models in modern history. Apple's commission was set at 30%. Sell a $1 app. Apple keeps 30 cents. Sell a subscription. Apple takes its share again. The tech industry eventually gave this model a nickname: the Apple tax. For years, almost nobody could challenge it. And the reason was surprisingly simple. Apple didn't just own the App Store. It owned the only legal doorway into every iPhone. If your app wanted access to hundreds of millions of users, there was only one entrance. And Apple controlled the gate. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Fast forward to 2025. The App Store has grown from just 500 apps to an ecosystem serving over 850 million weekly users across 175 countries. Nearly 38 billion downloads happen every year. The numbers are almost impossible to imagine. But here's the biggest surprise of all. That famous $1.4 trillion headline you've probably seen in the news isn't actually telling you how Apple makes its money. And once we break down those numbers, you'll see why the real story is hiding in a much smaller piece of the pie. Now comes the part almost every headline gets wrong. That $1.4 trillion number sounds like Apple's revenue. But it isn't. And once you break it apart, the entire business starts to look completely different. Let's see where that money actually comes from. Out of that $1.4 trillion, roughly $1.1 trillion comes from physical goods and services. Think about ordering groceries through Instacart, booking an Uber, buying clothes, or ordering dinner through a food delivery app. All of those transactions count toward Apple's massive headline number. But here's the shocking part. Apple earns absolutely nothing from most of those purchases. No commission. No percentage. Nothing. Now ask yourself a simple question. If Apple isn't making money from over $1 trillion, then why does everyone keep talking about the App Store as a money printing machine? Because there's another category hiding underneath. In-app advertising. Developers earned roughly $151 billion from ads displayed inside their apps. Again, Apple takes virtually none of that revenue. So what's actually left? This is where the real business begins. Digital goods and services. Things like game currency, premium subscriptions, extra features, streaming memberships, and in-app purchases. That category totaled around $149 billion. Compared to $1.4 trillion, it looks surprisingly small. But this tiny slice is where Apple applies its famous 15 to 30% commission. This is the only part of the entire ecosystem where Apple directly collects billions of dollars. And suddenly, the trillion-dollar headline starts making much more sense. Because Apple doesn't need to control the entire pie. It only needs to control the most profitable slice. But here's where things become even more interesting. If Apple's real business is only this small section, why does the company constantly highlight the much bigger trillion-dollar number? The answer is actually brilliant corporate strategy. By emphasizing that nearly 90% of App Store activity is commission-free, Apple can tell regulators, developers, and the public, look how much value we create without taking a cent. It's an incredibly powerful argument. But critics see the situation very differently. They argue that Apple didn't create most of that economic activity. People would still order food, book taxis, and buy clothes, even if those apps existed somewhere else. From their perspective, Apple is simply counting transactions that happen to pass through an iPhone. And that's exactly why the debate has become so controversial. Because this isn't really about how big the pie is anymore. It's about who controls the gate to the most valuable slice. And that single question has triggered some of the biggest legal battles in modern technology. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. For years, developers complained about Apple's commission. Some accepted it. Others hated it. But one company decided complaining wasn't enough. They declared war. That company was Epic Games. If you've ever heard of Fortnite, you've already seen the beginning of this battle. In 2020, Epic Games did something they knew Apple would never tolerate. They secretly added their own payment system inside Fortnite. Players could now buy in-game currency directly from Epic, completely bypassing Apple's 30% commission. It wasn't an accident. It was a carefully planned attack, and Epic knew exactly what Apple would do next. Within hours, Apple removed Fortnite from the App Store. For most companies, that would have been a disaster. But for Epic, it was exactly the plan. Because the moment Fortnite disappeared, Epic launched a perfectly prepared marketing campaign. They released a video parody of Apple's legendary 1984 commercial. But this time, Apple wasn't the hero. Apple was the villain. The internet exploded. News outlets around the world covered the story. And what started as a disagreement over app payments quickly became one of the biggest antitrust battles in tech history. But here's where things became even more interesting. After years inside courtroom, the judges made their decision. Apple won many of the biggest arguments.
Action!
The courts didn't force Apple to allow completely independent app stores on the iPhone. But Apple didn't walk away with a complete victory. On one critical issue, Apple lost. The court ruled that developers must be allowed to direct users to outside payment websites. That meant customers could pay developers directly, without using Apple's payment system. In simple words, the court had just punched a hole in Apple's toll booth. Apple wasn't happy. The company delayed implementing the ruling. It argued over the details. It tried to keep as much control as possible. But that decision created an even bigger problem. In 2025, a federal judge held Apple in contempt for deliberately violating the court's order. Later that year, an appeals court upheld that decision. Meanwhile, this wasn't only happening inside the United States. Across Europe, regulators were watching closely. Under the European Union's Digital Markets Act, Apple was fined €500 million for failing to comply with new competition rules. And Europe wasn't alone. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Brazil also began investigating Apple's App Store policies. Suddenly, this was no longer just a fight between Apple and Epic Games. It had become a global battle over who controls the future of smartphone apps. And here's the most important thing to understand. Governments weren't fighting Apple because of the $1.4 trillion headline. They were fighting over something much smaller. The tiny slice where Apple controls billions of dollars and decides who gets access to one of the most valuable digital marketplaces on Earth. But here's the question nobody had answered yet. Why was Apple willing to risk lawsuits, billion-dollar fines, and years of legal battles just to protect that one small slice of revenue? Because the App Store was never the real business. It was protecting something much bigger.
Everything we've talked about so far has been leading to this moment. Because here's the biggest misconception about Apple's App Store. The App Store isn't Apple's real business. It's the engine powering something much bigger. Analysts often call it Apple's services flywheel. And once you understand how this flywheel works, you'll never look at Apple the same way again. It starts with something simple. You buy an iPhone. That's the first step. But Apple was never trying to make just one sale. It was trying to keep you inside its ecosystem for years. The moment you own an iPhone, you download apps. You subscribe to Apple Music. You pay for iCloud storage. You watch Apple TV Plus. You buy in-game items. You pay for premium subscriptions. Little by little, your digital life starts moving into Apple's ecosystem. And that's exactly what Apple wants. Because every service you use makes it just a little harder to leave. Think about it. Your photos are in iCloud. Your messages sync across Apple devices. Your subscriptions renew automatically. Your purchased apps stay inside your Apple account. Now imagine switching to Android tomorrow. Suddenly, you're not just changing your phone. You're leaving an entire digital world behind. That's the real product Apple has built. An ecosystem that's incredibly valuable, because it's incredibly difficult to leave. Now let's look at the money. In fiscal 2025, Apple's services business generated more than $109 billion in revenue. That's already one of the largest businesses on the planet. Only the iPhone generated more, at roughly $209 billion. But here's what makes Apple's strategy so brilliant. The services business doesn't just generate profit. It helps sell more iPhones. And every new iPhone sold creates another customer who buys more services. Which creates more profit. Which helps Apple build even better hardware. Even better chips. Even tighter software integration. And the cycle starts all over again. That's why analysts call it a flywheel. Every part strengthens every other part. And once it starts spinning, it becomes incredibly difficult for competitors to stop. Which finally brings us back to the question we asked earlier. Why does Apple fight so hard over App Store commissions? The answer isn't simply because of the money. It's because the commission protects the flywheel. If developers slowly move payments outside the App Store, Apple doesn't just lose commission revenue. It slowly loses control over the ecosystem itself. And for Apple, control has always been more valuable than the commission. Because whoever controls the ecosystem controls the future of the smartphone industry. But the biggest challenge to that control is only just beginning. So, where does Apple's trillion-dollar App Store go from here? The answer could reshape the future of every smartphone on Earth. Because for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Apple's control is facing pressure from every direction. And this time, it's not just coming from one company. It's coming from the entire world. The first challenge is regulation. The European Union has already forced Apple to change parts of its App Store. The United States continues to challenge Apple's practices in court. And countries like Japan, South Korea, and Brazil are asking the same question. Should one company really control the only gateway to hundreds of millions of smartphones? But regulation isn't Apple's only problem. A much bigger disruption is quietly approaching. Artificial intelligence. AI isn't just changing how people search the internet. It's changing how people use apps. Imagine asking an AI assistant to book your flight, order groceries, reserve a hotel, and pay automatically. If an AI makes the purchase instead of the user, who earns the commission? Apple? The AI company? Or the developer? That question doesn't have a clear answer yet. And the company that solves it first could shape the next decade of the app economy. Meanwhile, developers are adapting. More companies are encouraging customers to subscribe directly through their own websites. Every customer who pays outside the App Store is one less commission flowing to Apple. It's happening slowly, almost quietly. But over time, those small changes could become a very big problem. None of this means Apple's empire is about to collapse. Far from it. But for the first time, the walls around Apple's famous walled garden are beginning to crack. And maybe that's the biggest lesson in this entire story. Apple wants the world to remember one number. $1.4 trillion. It's an incredible headline. It's impressive. It's memorable. But it isn't the number Apple is really protecting. The real battle has always been over a much smaller number. Because that's where the power lives. Once you understand that, you'll start seeing the same strategy everywhere. Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Even the biggest companies in the world rarely protect their biggest revenue streams. They protect the tiny piece that controls everything else. That's how modern business empires are built. Not by owning the whole market, but by controlling the gate everyone else has to walk through. And that's what makes Apple's App Store so fascinating. It was never just an app marketplace. It became one of the most powerful control systems ever built in the digital economy. So now I want to hear your opinion. Do you think Apple's commission is fair compensation for building the platform? Or has it become an outdated tax on developers? Let me know in the comments, I read every one of them. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't just explain billion-dollar companies. We uncover the hidden business strategies that built trillion-dollar empires. And trust me, Apple is only the beginning.